Welcome. I am Priestess Erica, and this is the first video of its kind, and certainly won't be the last. Please excuse the rippling behind the backdrop. I have a little gray feline friend in here today who just thinks it is totally irresistible back there, so that's fine. She can go ahead and do that. Today I'm going to have a conversation about people who are different from the norm, from typical, and spirituality. This is something that has been on my mind for quite a while now, in part because of who I am, that I am very different from the norm in a number of ways, and because, of course, since I'm that way, a lot of the people that I associate with are that way as well. And I've noticed some things about us, as well as I've noticed some things when researching ancient spiritual traditions about people like us. So specifically, I'm talking about people who are not typical, people who don't fit the mold of society, whatever that mold looks like in your time and place. So, for example, nowadays and historically, a lot of what I'm talking about are queer people, genderqueer people, people who don't fit into the reproductive relationship, expected gender for what your body appears to be, kind of roles, and also people who are neurodivergent. So autistic people, people who have depression, anxiety, OCD, ADHD, any of those things make you different from typical. You know, we talk about neurodivergence as opposed to neurotypicality. And so that's essentially what I'm talking about here today is the typical, what is average for humanity. And when we look at ancient culture, which is where a lot of these ideas actually come from, of the ideas that I've had, and a lot of them are borrowed from ancient cultures and cultures who are still connected to their ancient practices today, whereas some of us have had that lineage broken and we're reconnecting. A lot of cultures are still connected to that, and they still have these kinds of practices if the colonizer viewpoint hasn't eradicated them, at least superficially. So we're talking about people who look different. And there's a very interesting line in the Poetic Edda when it's talking about the transition of this particular figure, a goddess, I would argue. And a lot of people, including myself, believe that this is a Heidi, so a different name for Freya, and this is Gullveig Heitr. And she has two names because this is an initiation story. So at the beginning of the story, her name is Gullveig, and she goes through the initiation process and she comes out Heitr, a different name, a different purpose in society. One of the things they say about Heitr, who has been initiated into a special kind of magic, is that she now goes through the world, visits different villages, and she teaches women her art, this art of magic that she learned through this initiation process. And specifically, she teaches women, and it depends on the translation you look at as far as what it says, but basically it says women who would be bad wives. And honestly, that's pretty much me and a lot of us. For example, if you're a queer woman, you might not make a very good wife in a heteronormative society. If you're a lesbian in particular, you're unlikely to want to settle down with a man and produce babies and live that kind of typical lifestyle that was expected. And there is this concept that we'll get into as well of a taboo. In fact, we'll probably get into it now. The concept of a taboo, as we understand it in our modern society, is to say that something is off limits. To say something is taboo, a word or a phrase or a way of being is taboo, is to say that one should not touch it. You don't go there because that takes you out of the norm of society, and that's not good. So we don't do that. That's what taboo means in our typical understanding nowadays. However, when the word was created, that's not what it meant. It did mean some of that. It certainly meant somebody or something, some word, some practice, some way of being that was outside of the norm, outside of the typical, but it did not mean that that was off limits. that this taboo meant that we never touch that thing, we never touch that practice, that way of being, what have you, that we don't touch it. That's not what it meant. In fact, quite the opposite. For something to be taboo in an ancient practice, or even in a lot of modern practices, even though we have this current understanding that for something to be taboo means it's off limits and we don't touch it, what it actually means is that it is a source of great power, really immense power. And of course, everything that is powerful is dangerous. So there is some truth to, if something is taboo, maybe you might want to stay away from it, but not in a that's off limits, that's not okay, not going to happen kind of way. So being queer, particularly being interested in same-sex relationships versus a opposite sex reproductive relationship, is and has been in many societies taboo. But that doesn't mean that it was illegal, wrong, cast out of society, something that was looked down on. In fact, it usually means that those people who were that taboo, so people like me and perhaps like you, that we are something special, that we are something that is set aside from normal. And this, we actually have another remnant of this in our language today, where we talk about people who are neurodivergent in particular as being touched. You know, when we talk about, and we don't use this word so much anymore, but it is a word I use for myself, so I'm going to say it here. When we talk about someone being crazy, we talk about them being touched in the head. And that means touched by the divine. And so this person who is neurodivergent, who perceives the world differently than someone who's neurotypical, this person has a special kind of connection to the divine, and that is why they perceive the world differently. And it's the same thing with people who are genderqueer or queer. You are not presenting in a typical way. So perhaps you were assigned female at birth or male at birth, and you don't feel that that matches who you are, and so you're not. So now you have redefined who you are versus what somebody else had defined you as being. Or perhaps you don't identify as being essentially on the binary at all, and you are gender fluid, non-binary, what have you. That is essentially atypical, not normal. I hate using that word, but there you have it. And that means that you are set apart from the rest of society. That means who you are, how you express your gender, your sexuality, perhaps how you live your life, if we're talking about neurodivergence and sometimes about various types of queerness. It is different. And the reason it is different is because the gods have set you apart, or the divine, depending on your tradition. But this is something I have seen across traditions, in multiple places. You see it in a number of indigenous North American traditions. I have seen it in my own Nordic traditions, ancient pre-Christian Nordic traditions. There are remnants of this. It's hard to track down specifically because we don't have a lot of things left over. But there are a number of things that are really good proofs. Like, for example, one of the most famous burials that was ever found, famous because of the grave goods that were there and the ship that was found, and the fact that most burials like this were cremated prior to a mound being erected. So we don't have much in the way of grave goods, skeletons, ships. Those things were burnt up and we have ashen pieces. But the Oaseburg Burial was not cremated before the mound was erected over it. So we were able to excavate it. And when they first excavated this burial, this burial is so interesting to me. And we find this kind of pattern that I'm going to discuss here in a lot of archaeology, where there are things changing now that it's not just a bunch of old white dudes looking at these things with their biases that they bring, but now that the field of archaeology is getting more diverse, and more diverse people are putting their eyes on these artifacts and these finds and bringing our life experiences to it, now there are different things being understood about them. So in the case of the Oaseburg ship, it's a very elaborate burial, lots and lots of grave goods, and there were 2 skeletons that were found in this burial, buried in a bed together. So it was assumed that they were a couple, partnered, and the grave goods found with them, with both of them, but with one of them in particular, indicated that these were spirit workers, basically. They were likely volur, which is a category of spirit worker in ancient Scandinavia that was a witch, basically, is the easiest way to translate that. These were people who traveled from village to village, often did things like telling the weather, changing the weather, telling people's fates. They also did some officiating of things like funerals and marriages, things like that. However, so these are two, especially the one person, but likely both people, were religious professionals in their time, and clearly very important people who were well respected in their community based on how they were buried. You know, this burial is quite remarkable. And initially, because they had two people buried together, and one person was clearly a bit more important than the other person, initially the people who found it decided that this was a male-female couple. And that was that, and they moved on. However, more recently, someone had a look at and did some genetic testing on the skeleton that they had decided, the archaeological community, had decided was a male, and they discovered that actually both of these skeletons are females. And the one of them that had been misidentified has a growth disorder that led to various bony growths on their skeleton, which made it harder to identify without genetic testing, but also makes me wonder if that person might not have been genderqueer in some regard. We have very little evidence that there was a lot of this happening. There actually is a story in the sagas where there's a person who today we would define as transgendered. But other than that, there's not a lot of evidence of this. But the fact that there is one story and that it has been treated relatively unremarkably, when people are talking in this story to and about the character, there's nothing, it's not a shock that this character is what we would call trans. They may have called themselves something else, but regardless, that's what we have in this burial. We have two females who are being buried as a partnered, essentially married couple, both of whom were religious professionals, and one of whom may or may not have been genderqueer. That's just a thing that we can throw out there because this person would not have had a typical female appearance, but perhaps she was not. Regardless, they are a same-sex couple, and clearly well respected and very important religious professionals. So we see this kind of thing in numerous cultures, and part of it is because it is not usual. There's another thing that we see like this that pops up in a number of different cultures, where an animal shows up who is pure white. And this is something that does happen in nature. Albino animals pop up occasionally. There's a certain genetic chance that that's going to happen in a given species, but it happens very rarely. So it is uncommon to see these white animals of species and breeds that are not already white. So for example, a white bison, or a white stag. These things would be quite unusual, and they do happen in nature, but they happen rarely. So when they show up, it is seen as either a sign from the gods, or often that animal is seen as a divine messenger themselves, as perhaps even an emanation or avatar of the deity themselves. So again, we have something that is relatively uncommon and still possible, and when it shows up, it's seen as divine. And additionally, when we look at the stories of the deities in most cultures, we find that some things the deities are doing are things that are considered taboo in the culture, that would not really have been okay for the average person to have done. So for example, in a number of stories, we have deities who are siblings sleeping together and sometimes even producing offspring. In most of the cultures that I can think of where this myth occurs, this is not something that's okay in that culture. You don't get married to your siblings, you don't make children with your siblings. And perhaps it's something that happened occasionally and was not a major deal for them, but it wasn't the norm. So again, we have an example here of deities being not the norm. And then there are a number of shape-shifting deities who change gender, and sometimes fairly frequently. So there's a specific example of deities that fill this role of essentially being gender fluid, genderqueer, and obviously it's a part of their power, the fact that they can shapeshift and do that. So I know from what I have seen today in the modern world, and then based on all of these stories, particularly in the Norse world, because that's the world I am most steeped in, most familiar with, we see these examples of individuals who are outside of the norm, one way or another. And because of that, they're extra powerful. So, for example, in the Norse world, one of the deities that shapeshifts and frequently changes gender is Loki. And shapeshifting is one of Loki's major powers. I mean, he certainly has plenty of others, but that's one of the major ones. And the fact this gender switching that Loki does, when they do that, it is usually because that's necessary to make the story move on to the next point, to cause an event to happen that has to happen for the good of everybody involved. So, or sometimes not, depending on the story. Regardless, obviously this is one of the great powers of Loki, where if Loki did not have this power, a lot of the stories and goals and things that Loki has accomplished would not have happened, or at least would have happened in a different way. So here again, we have an example, a very specific example of someone who is very specifically what we would call genderqueer. Again, perhaps they didn't use that terminology, but we have a deity who shapeshifts and seems very comfortable in either a female or a male body. It does not seem to matter too much as long as the goal is able to be accomplished. So the same thing applies with those of us who don't fit the molds. And we have a very interesting experience in our society today that might be different from the ancient world, and that I think is different from the ancient world, where who we are, whether that's genderqueer, queer, neurodivergent, is often seen as being other, and not in the sense of that is a taboo thing that you are, do, be, and therefore it makes you very powerful. So we set you apart from society because you're really powerful and you're really special to us as a village or community. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody wants to interact with you all the time, because bad magical things might happen to them if they do that, if they upset you. But rather, we have been otherized in a way that ostracizes us from society. And I believe, and have seen in others and in my own personal experience, that this actually intensifies our connection to the divine. And I really feel like humanity is coming upon this moment where a large portion of us, there are certainly portions of us that are kind of already there and don't so much need this, but a large portion of us need to be reconnected to the ideas of interconnectedness, and the respect for nature that comes from that, the magic that is available to us in this wild and wonderful world and universe that we live in, that all of these things are coming back around. And it's very important, and I feel in a lot of ways that this reawakening of spirituality is a part of what is going to save humanity from a lot of the troubles that we are currently collectively facing, that have not been caused by all of us, but that we are all facing the results of, unfortunately. So if you are somebody who has been cast out as being different, whether that's because your brain works differently, perhaps you are sad all the time, maybe you're anxious and have a hard time leaving your home because the world is a loud, scary place, maybe you have OCD and it really just cripples you. Perhaps you are autistic and you don't fit into society easily because of that. Or maybe, and of course, for a lot of queer folks, not all of us, but for a lot of us, there's much more societal acceptance now. Less so for trans folks and genderqueer folks. But if you are in these categories, know that this thing that society tells you is wrong about you, whether they're telling that to you in a very loud way and a very, very harmful and obvious way, or whether they're telling it to you in quiet ways, like asking when you're going to have kids and things like that, regardless of how it's happening. When society tells you this thing is broken in you, know that it is not. Know that this thing is taboo. Yes, 100%. And that means that it may be your greatest source of power. And even if it isn't, it certainly is a great source of power, even if you have other greater sources of power. So difference is our strength. This is something that I have known forever, really, but that only recently I've been able to articulate in a way that is understandable to others for a number of reasons. And I hope that this video, if you have not already accepted, loved, deeply connected with those parts of yourself that society says are wrong and are no good, and that perhaps your spiritual path has even told you are wrong and no good, and that God hates that, well, I don't know, I can't speak for every God, I suppose, but I know there are a lot of gods who don't hate that, and who in fact love that deeply, and who will in fact even use that difference to make great and wonderful things happen in your life and in the lives of people around you. So stick with it. I know it can be hard, and I know that it's really hard when society is telling us that we're wrong and that who we are is not okay. And for people who are neurodivergent or who are being deeply affected by how society is telling them that they are not okay, you know, we can really be suffering a lot on a psychological, well, a psycho-spiritual, emotional level. And that can feel just like dying. It really can. And I want to tell you that it can get better. And that also is a huge source of power. Being that close to death, and this is probably something we'll have to talk about another time, but being that close to death, whether it's that you are physically close to death, or that you are just friends with death because you feel like you're dying all the time, or perhaps feel like you want to die all the time. I'm there a fair amount of the time myself, so if that's you, I have deep compassion for you. That proximity to one of the greatest transformations that we are aware of in our current embodied state is another source of great spiritual power. Death is, among other things, it's a metaphor for just about every change that humans experience in their lives, as though I'm not one of us in our lives. And being close to that energy is a really powerful thing. And I know that a lot of what I'm saying is relatively acceptable in some of the pagan or essentially non-Christian spiritual tradition communities, but other parts of it are not. And sometimes that is a piece that is not, because everybody is so concerned about being positive all the time, love and light, all of this kind of stuff. You probably guessed by now I'm not like that. I really believe that balance is what's key. Balance is absolutely what is key. And actually, this is a part of why people who are divergent in one way or another, who are not typical, are so powerful, because everybody else in society is holding the other end of that polarity, the typical end, their brains work in the way that human brains expect to work, and that they can happily be in reproductive relationships and, you know, do all of that normal gender role thing. A lot of these ancient societies I'm talking about did have fairly strong gender roles, but that doesn't mean you couldn't escape them. Again, this story of Gulveig Heither, the women that Heither is teaching specifically are women who would make bad wives. Now that doesn't, I mean, for me, that is clearly screaming women who are queer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that was the only women who would make bad wives. Maybe these were just women who did not feel in any way genderqueer, and perhaps they were straight, but they just did not want to be burdened, tied to that role of being the mistress of the estate, having children, being a mother, doing all of that kind of normal stuff. And instead, they wanted to live a life that was independent, where they essentially had their own business. You know, that's these traveling volur, that's essentially what they did. They did not rely on anyone else for producing income. They were paid for what services they offered. So they were small business people, mostly women, but I am fairly positive they weren't entirely women, not completely. So these people, we are extremely powerful. We are closer to the divine because of who we are. And any religion that wants to tell you otherwise has gotten themselves too tangled up in supporting the appearance of what they've decided is normal, and possibly too tangled up in trying to suppress the power of average people, of what we would call lay people, people who have not been initiated into being a religious professional in that tradition. Those of us who haven't been initiated into being a religious professional by a particular tradition in a particular way, it doesn't mean we don't have power. It doesn't mean we can't access power. But there have been traditions that are still going pretty strong today that insist that the only people who have spiritual religious power are people who have been initiated in the way that they say they should be initiated, whatever that happens to be. And so a part of this desire to make taboos things that are untouchable rather than just things that are very powerful that we need to take care with is this investment in keeping what they would call lay people, those of us who have not been initiated, in keeping us out of positions of power, out of having any authority in our speech, especially those of us who do look a little abnormal. There we go, there's that word again, normal, who do look atypical. Of course, these traditions want everybody who's not initiated to not have any power. But those of us who break the mold a bit, we kind of mess up a lot of their stories and a lot of the ways they say the world should work. And so we're a threat on that level. But again, we're also much closer to this divine power. And it's something that a number of us have access to without having any training. We just have a talent in it, which is good and bad. Having a talent in things spiritual, again, it can be quite dangerous because it is powerful. And just like with anything powerful, you know, going out and driving a car is dangerous. Cars are powerful. Now, if you go out and drive a car and don't know what you're doing, you might end up hurting or killing yourself and many other people. However, if you go out and drive a car and do know what you're doing, you can accomplish great things with the power of that car, and everybody can remain safe. So this is where having a spiritual talent can be dangerous, because it comes naturally to you, and we don't live in a society, most of us nowadays, where there is access to people as mentors who can train us, who can teach us what to do with this talent so that we don't hurt ourselves or others, or at least that we hurt ourselves or others minimally as we're learning how to manage this talent that we have. And this is another thing that is very, very important to me, very near and dear to my heart, is that we need more spiritual teachers. And in particular, because again, the whole focus of this video is those of us who are so-called atypical, whether that's in how our brains work, how we present ourselves in society, whether or not we fill typical gender roles, all of those kind of things, any of those ways that we're atypical and have been otherized by society, we often don't have as much access to spiritual teachers as people who look more typical, even in the pagan community nowadays. There are segments of the pagan community that are very bioessentialist, and I will talk about that more on another time for sure, because that's a huge pet peeve of mine, as you might guess, since I am queer. It's something I think about, and it's something that bothers me. But because of that, even in that community, we often don't get access to the help that we need in the form of essentially a spiritual mentorship or spiritual training. And this can be true also for certain types of neurodivergence. For example, I have psychosis, and I know that a number of spiritual teachers are very concerned about dealing with people who have psychosis, because if you don't know what you're doing with it, it can become very dangerous. Fortunately, my psychosis personally has never been a real problem in my life, at least not at any times that anyone noticed. When I was younger, it absolutely affected my life in somewhat negative ways, but when I was younger, I thought everyone was like this. So I never thought to ask anyone for help, because I just thought this was how things were. In part because I was young and didn't share my experiences, so I didn't hear that they weren't typical. And in part because I was raised in a, oh, that's maybe a video for another time too. I was raised in a fundamentalist but very spiritualist Christian tradition. I was raised in a church that is just adjacent to Pentecostalism. So people seeing visions, healing people with the laying on of hands, all of these kinds of things were taught to me, and I believed them implicitly. And part of why is because I experienced some of those things myself. So of course people experience visions. I have visions every morning. That seems very normal to me. So I was really taught that it was quite normal. And because the level of my psychosis is not enough that it interferes with my life, and because I eventually learned that it isn't normal, typical, and learned to be able to very easily distinguish most of the time between what I'm seeing and experiencing is essentially the extra senses that are given to me with psychosis, and what things are a part of consensual reality. I've been able to navigate that pretty well, and I know that's not the same for everybody. So that's part of why people being spiritual teachers, spiritual directors, are often hesitant to mentor someone who has something like that, or someone who otherwise is less connected with consensual reality. And unfortunately, we are the people who have usually the strongest spiritual talents. If there were such a rating scale, and there is not, the biggest spiritual gifts, but there's no larger or smaller. Spiritual gifts are spiritual gifts. So actually, I did not intend to talk about this in this video, but offering this kind of mentoring is something that I do, because I have had to mostly figure this out on my own, and with a lot of sometimes helpful, sometimes very unhelpful, especially as more neurodivergence came to the surface and my queerness came to the surface. A lot of the help that I received from the community I grew up in, spiritually speaking, was not very helpful, and was in fact very damaging. And because of that, I've ended up finding my own path. And I desperately want to help other people do the same thing. And I want to help you be able to skip over a lot of the pain that I went through as I was sorting out who I was spiritually, what my gifts were, what I was able to do, whether or not it was normal. And if it wasn't normal, did that mean I shouldn't do it? There's so much there, so much. And I just want you to know that if you are struggling with that there are people who can help. And perhaps it's me, perhaps it's not me, but perhaps it's me. And if that's the case, please reach out, because I would love to chat with you about where you're at, and what kind of help you might need, and if there's something that I can do to help you. I have, all of these revelations I've shared today, and the ones that are to come, most of them are things I've figured out in the last 10 years. And I'm not super old, I'm 37. But that means I've lived the majority of my life without this insight. And like I said, I was raised in this adjacent to Pentecostal tradition. So I had some information about some of this really early on. And it was just, for the first 25-ish years, a slow journey of figuring out who I was and what I could do and what was safe and all of these kinds of things. And in the beginning, there was a lot of not safe happening. And this is part of why it is so important to have a mentor, to have a trainer, essentially, a spiritual director, someone who can help you navigate through all of that. Because as you start to discover and utilize your talents, whether on purpose or not, when I was 11, 12, I wasn't necessarily doing these things on purpose, but I was still accessing, seeing, experiencing some things that were very scary and that I know now were very dangerous. At the time, sometimes I knew they were dangerous and sometimes I didn't, which is probably better because I would probably have been much more terrified if I'd known how dangerous all of that was at the time. But it was certainly uncomfortable, very frightening, and very painful. It was really painful, especially as I got older and started to learn that these parts of me were considered not normal. Not just the queerness, but the neurodivergence I had as well, and that it wasn't accepted and that I shouldn't talk about it and all of this. So I had really no one to go to at that point. As soon as I realized that this wasn't normal and not everyone was like this, then I also lost any semblance of support that I had at the time. So if that's you, if you are finding yourself in a place where you have spiritual talents, or you suspect that you do and you're getting ready to start accessing them, and you definitely want, and I would definitely recommend, some help of some level with that, then reach out. And if you are someone like me who has been experiencing this your whole life, and maybe this is the first time that you've seen someone talk about it in this way, where you know that it's not typical, but it's not abnormal. In fact, it's very good. It's very powerful. It's very incredible. And you can learn to get the gems out of your pain. I'm not going to say that I live a life that now is pain-free. It's certainly a lot less painful than it used to be, but among the reasons that I am not typical, there are things like severe depression, and it can be really painful at times still. But knowing the spiritual background, knowing what this puts me in touch with, knowing how I can utilize it, all of these things really help make it much more bearable, and they make the pain much less. And of course, this happens most of the time. If you're experiencing pain and you don't perceive that there's any purpose to it, that pain becomes much worse, much harder to deal with, much harder to cope with. But as soon as you know there's a purpose to the pain, it's easier. So for example, when I go and get a tattoo, obviously I have several of them, it's pretty painful, I'm not gonna lie. I have a pretty good pain tolerance, but most of the time when I go and get tattoos, I'm sitting for at least 6 hours, and it's rough. It's rough. But because there's a purpose to that pain, I know that there's this gorgeous piece of art that's going to happen, and every single one of my tattoos has a spiritual significance, magical significance as well. So I know also that this pain is a part of the price that I am paying for the magic that I am having permanently etched on my skin. Keeping that purpose in mind, it's far easier to endure that pain. It doesn't make it not pain, but it does make it easier to endure. So if that's you, if you're experiencing pain of rejection from society because you are atypical in a way that you're being otherized, or the pain of accessing these gifts and experiencing the dangerous side of it, the scary side of it, because you don't have anyone to help you, please reach out, because I would love to either help you myself or perhaps point you in the direction of someone else who can potentially help you if I am not able to help you. So that's it for this video. If you are queer, genderqueer, neurodivergent, please know that that is not an accident. That while who you are, how you express, how you be in the world might be unusual. I mean, the estimate that I'm not sure is entirely accurate, but the estimate is that about 10% of people are queer. That's not a super tiny amount. Certainly when we look at albinism in animals, the other example I brought up, that's much more rare. But it's still not typical. It's still not average. And actually, we might talk about this another time too. I'm noticing there are more and more neurodivergent people anymore. Things like where we're diagnosing more and more autism, which maybe it's because we weren't good at diagnosing it before, or maybe it's because there's more of it now. Hard to say. But that's certainly not the only thing that there's more and more of. And it's because we need spirit workers. We really do. So again, if you're in that place of pain, you are very special. You are very needed. The world, humanity, plants, animals, you are needed right now. Your special talents, your special skills, absolutely necessary. No matter what the world tells you about who you are and how you express, you are needed. And you are, in my estimation, going to be an integral part of what saves humanity. If anything can save us, it's going to be the magical people. And if you are in these categories, you're certainly one of them. Even if you don't feel particularly magical, the fact that you're in one of these categories, again, puts you in this place that you are liminal, basically. You're not typical. You're not living the kind of life that is expected of you. And that puts you in a place where you're not really one thing, but you're not really the other thing. And you're in this magical space of liminality, of transformation, of ultimate endless possibility that you can access. You know, maybe it doesn't mean that you have endless possibilities for what you can do with your brain or what have you, but it does put you in this space of not being one thing or the other thing as far as society is concerned, of being liminal, of being constantly standing in this threshold that is transformation. And that makes it much easier for you to access transformation for yourself and for others. And that's exactly what magic is, and that's exactly what we need right now in the world. So if you would like to get in touch with me, I'm going to have some details in the description that you can get in touch. Otherwise, please like, subscribe if you want to see more of this content. I am going to be producing lots more of these videos. Obviously, I just mentioned like 3 that I need to do here that I don't think are on my list that already has about 6 things on it. So there will be lots more of this content where we talk about the spiritual and from somewhat of a different angle than what most people are doing. Certainly from a different angle than the average and typical in my culture, which is North American culture, that's very Christian. Even if people are not actually church-going Christians, culturally we're very Christian, and this is all quite different. I mean, there's some of this in Christianity as well, but a lot of this, most of my spiritual ideas are things that I have come to since leaving Christianity, and there's so much power there, and so many people in establishment, which includes, because Christianity became this big political powerhouse, it includes Christianity. So many people want to keep that power from us, and it's ours. That's why they want to keep it from us, because it's ours and it's easy for us to get if we just want it. So like, subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content. If you want to reach out to me because you think that maybe I can help you, or maybe I can help you find someone who can help you, I'll have some details in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.